This is Distance Learning edition of Government One with Mr. Tigert here for week number one. Today we're going to be talking about the road to the Constitution. So I'm going to be going through this presentation that I normally would be giving in class, but due to COVID-19 and not able to do. So we're going to go through this, and then afterwards you're going to have some assignments to work on as well, which you can check your Canvas and learn more about that. So first of all, let's talk about the road to the Constitution. What are our big questions that we're trying to answer here? Number one, what were the Articles of Confederation? Why did they fail? Two, why is the Constitution a document of compromises? So, first of all, let's talk about this Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation are kind of the Constitution 1.0. They were the nation's first attempt to create a new government. So, after the Revolutionary War, the former colonies are now independent states. And because they're independent states, they each write their own constitution. And if we look at some of the ideas in these constitutions, like the Virginia Declaration of Rights, you'll see some ideas that are going to be later incorporated into the broader national government. Like, take this for example, that the legislative and executive powers of the state should be separate and distinct from the judiciary. That's separation of powers, right? It's an idea we learned about from the Enlightenment. That the freedom of press is one of the greatest bulwarks of liberty and can never be restrained but by despotic governments. Freedom of the press. Later it'll be enshrined into the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. All men are created equally and entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. Again, freedom of religion. First Amendment. That a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people trained to arms is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. Ideas that will be incorporated into the Second Amendment of the Constitution. So most of these state constitutions are going to set up separation of powers, having different branches of government, and they're going to include some sort of declaration of rights for the citizens. One thing that was different from today, though, is that in order to vote, typically you had to be a property owner. So think about who could vote. Well, first of all, you had to be man. You had to be male. You had to own property, and typically you had to be white. So the ability to vote was pretty limited at this time. Now, eventually, there's also this idea that all of the states, having a common heritage, and triumphing in this revolution to become independent from Great Britain, should also have this bigger thing that would unite them all together. And this bigger thing is going to be called the Articles of Confederation. It's under this document that the name the United States of America is first enshrined as the name of the nation. And it says that the states hereby enter into a firm league of friendship. That sounds like the worst superhero group ever. So the Articles of Confederation, like I said, it's the Constitution 1.0. It's the colonists' first attempt to try to form a new national constitution for the United States, to say that all of these independent states are actually part of this bigger government as well. So, as I said earlier, the states are organized in this loose kind of league of friendship, as they call it. Now, the Articles of Confederation, it was intentionally a very weak form of government, and it reflected the experiences that the colonists had had under British rule. They felt like the British government was tyrannical and abused their rights, and so they wanted to create a new government that was limited, that would not do the things that the British government did. So we have, under the Articles of Confederation, only one branch of government. There's only a Congress, and the Congress every year is going to elect a president. Now, if you want to, wow somebody with some total history nerd trivia, you can say, well, it wasn't really George Washington that was the first president of the United States. Instead, It was John Hanson, because he was the first president of the Congress under the Articles of Confederation. Yeah, kind of random, useless trivia there. So, like I said, there's only one branch of government here. There's no executive, there's no judicial branch, only a Congress. And each state has representatives that represent the interests of the state. Now, the Articles of Confederation obviously is not around anymore, so it must have failed. Well, it did, and there's a lot of reasons why it didn't work out. One of the problems was, that it didn't have a separation of powers. There's no executive, there's no president, there's no judicial branch, solely a legislative branch. Also, Congress had no power to tax the states. They could ask states for money, but they had no ability to make them pay taxes. So think about what problems that might create. Well, what if the country is invaded? How do you raise an army? Soldiers don't always fight for free, they have to be paid, right? So you couldn't really, they had the power to raise an army, but they didn't have the ability to tax to be able to pay an army, and that's going to lead to problems later. Also, every single state is going to issue its own currency. We see all these examples here. There was no national currency, and Congress did not have the power to regulate trade between the states like it does under the Constitution. So think about what problems this would create. How do you trade across state lines? How much is a New York dollar in comparison to a New Jersey dollar? How do you figure out that exchange rate? Another issue was that it was really hard to make any changes to the Articles of Confederation. You had to have a supermajority, so 9 out of 13 states had to vote for laws. And if you wanted to make any changes to amend the Articles of Confederation, every single state, all 13, had to say yes. So if you had one holdout, if you had one state like Rhode Island saying no, the change could not happen. It's hard to get every state to agree on anything. I mean, it's hard to get everyone to agree on a single thing. So it was nearly impossible to change. Now, the event that is going to really lead to the end of the Articles of Confederation is a internal rebellion known as Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays had been a decorated soldier in the American Revolution. And like many soldiers, while he was away to war, his farm had kind of gone into disrepair. Obviously, he was away fighting. The government was broke after the American Revolution and didn't really have a way to pay the soldiers that had fought. And so they have a lot of back pay. They're all in debt. Many of them are starting to have their farms foreclosed on. And Daniel Shays decided he's going to do something about it. So he and other former Revolutionary War veterans are going to take up arms, and they're going to try to shut down the courthouses to prevent farmers from having their lands taken away. Later, they're also going to try to raid an armory in order to get weapons to eventually, their plan is to march on Boston and try to, shut down the government and make sure that their demands are met. Now, the problem was that since the country was so weak and the government was so weak, there was no way that an army could be created to go and put down this rebellion. So the government is so weak, it can't even deal with a small rebellion in its own midst. Eventually, the only way this gets stopped is some wealthy business owners from Boston are going to pay a militia to go and confront the revolutionaries, the Shays' Rebellion, and force eventually force them to surrender. So after Shays' Rebellion, it becomes abundantly clear that the government is way too weak and that changes need to be made to make a stronger federal government that can deal with not only internal rebellions, but also external threats from other nations. So that gets us to 1787. So delegations from every single state, except Rhode Island, are going to come to Philadelphia. And their task is to try to fix the Articles of Confederation. to try to create a stronger federal government that is going to work and is going to create a solid foundation for the future. In the end, we're going to have, as a result of this, the creation of the Constitution of the United States. So let's talk about the Constitutional Convention. So our big question that we're focusing on here is, why is the Constitution a document of compromises? So the Constitutional Convention is going to convene in Philadelphia in 1787. Now, the original task is simply to revise the Articles of Confederation, to make changes to it so it's going to work. But pretty early on, they realized that the Articles of Confederation is an unworkable document. It cannot be fixed. It cannot be amended. Instead, they're just going to pitch it. Now, think about this. We have, some of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the states all coming together, and essentially in this room they're overthrowing the government. Technically they're committing treason, and they could have got into a lot of trouble with this, but thankfully the Constitution is created, and generally people are accepting of that. So they decide right away that we got to pitch the Articles of Confederation. We're going to start fresh, a brand new organizational document here. So they make some rules at the convention. First, they're going to make everything, secretive. All the windows are shut, all the blinds are drawn. Remember, this is Philadelphia in the summer, so it's really, really hot. And look at what they're wearing. Full head-to-toe garments. It had to be incredibly sweltering in there, in that hall. So there's some big issues that needed to be resolved. First of all, how do we determine representation in Congress? The states are very different, have different populations, obviously. You have big Virginia, which is the largest state, and then tiny Rhode Island. Should they both have the same amount of representatives, or should larger states have more representatives and smaller states have less? Also, what about the question of slaves? Of course, this is a country at the time that has a large slave population. How do we determine how they should be counted when it comes to representation? Should they be counted in deciding how many representatives each state gets? Also, what exactly should be done about the institution of slavery? Should it be allowed to continue? Should it be sunsetted? Should the slave trade be able to be allowed to continue? These are questions that needed answers. So first of all, let's talk about representation. How should it be determined? Now, this is the person who is the most influential when it comes to the Constitutional Convention. You know who he is? Yep, James Madison, future President of the United States. Now, Madison did his homework, and he came to the Constitutional Convention with basically an entire constitution almost completely written out. His plan gets called the Virginia Plan, also known as the Big State Plan. Now, in the Virginia Plan, the idea is that the states will have proportional representation. So if you're a state that has a bigger population, you're going to have more representatives. And if you're a state that has a smaller population, well, you're going to have less representatives. So it's proportional to the population. Now, the small states are going to be upset with this. They're worried that they're going to be dominated by the larger states and essentially outvoted when it comes to every single measure. So they're going to propose their own plan, known as the New Jersey Plan or the Small State Plan. Ugh, Jersey Shore. In this plan, every state, regardless of the population, will have an equal amount of representatives. So yes, tiny Rhode Island and Connecticut will have the same power in government as somewhere like Virginia that has 10 or more times the population that those small states have. So this was very similar to the way that decisions were made on the Articles of Confederation. So obviously the large states were not going to go along with it because, hey, that didn't work the first time. So they're going to battle back and forth over the first couple days between these two plans. And eventually Roger Sherman of Connecticut is going to come in, and he's going to propose what we know as the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise because, well, he was from Connecticut. Under this compromise, a two-chamber legislature is going to